Today's topic is undoubtedly going to stir controversy. I know so many Crowdsource the Truth viewers and Trump supporters are also supporters of California Representative Devin Nunes. I'm welcoming back Diana West. Hello, Diana. How are you today?
I'm just fine, thanks, Jason. How are you?
I'm very well, and it is always my pleasure to have you on the show. Your information is so well researched and you are so knowledgeable. I always look forward to our conversations. For viewers who haven't seen you before, Diana, I like to also remind them that they can learn more about you and your years-long research, the books that you've written, articles that you're writing. They can find out all this information. They can go to dianawest.net. It's important that people get the .net there. And I do encourage people to purchase and read American Betrayal, The Red Thread. You've got literally a library of books that you've written, and you've been tracking this concept of a Marxist, communist infiltration of the government literally for decades.
Well, at least one decade, a solid decade anyway. Yes, definitely.
But the infiltration has been going on for decades. And for people who think that you and I are conspiracy theorists, this is a very common insult that is hurled by those that actually lack evidence. We see this happening. I mean, what is the Democratic congressman's name who introduced that 6666?
Bobby Rush.
Right.
Bobby Rush, the co-founder of the Black Panther Party in Illinois. Now a congressman introduced the 6666, seeking $100 billion to create a contact tracer army. This is very frightening stuff, but one thing I learned just today, I just popped it up on Twitter earlier today, is that back in 1970, as a Black Panther, Bobby Rush was discussed in Congress in the House Internal Security Subcommittee of the day, which was kind of like the latter day iteration of the House Un-American Activities Committee, for having been part of this Black Panther plan to essentially do exactly what we've been seeing done during this Corona coup, namely disrupt industry, break the food supply, create mass crowds that would prompt mass suppression by police and army. I mean, this is what he was describing, the revolution he hoped to foment as a Black Panther, would seem to be coming true 40 years later, and now he's a venerable congressman, but essentially pushing the revolutionary agenda without any minders looking at it that way either.
Yeah.
House Un-American Activities Committee is gone in ill repute, but he's there fomenting revolution, and oh gosh, do you think that bill will pass?
I certainly don't think it will, but it's a remarkable situation that we've got individuals who were Marxist revolutionaries not even a generation ago who are now in Congress making laws. And as you point out, it's not a conspiracy theory. This is what they said they wanted to do in the 1960s and the 1970s, and here we are seeing it happen. People are getting $1,200 checks in the mail from the government. Sounds like socialism to me. Lining up to buy stuff you're not allowed in the store unless you comply with these nonsensical, draconian edicts about medical requirements that are placed on individuals without any evaluation of how they might impact that individual. It's very upsetting. But we're going to focus today on Congressman Devin Nunes, and this is a subject I'm very interested in that most people have been reluctant to approach. What have you prepared for us, Diana?
Well, I'd like to look at the last 3 years or 4 years of Trump Russia, which is where we really learned, or many of us learned, who Devin Nunes was. Going back to 2016, he was the chairman of during the Republican majority in the House, he was the chairman of the mighty House Intelligence Committee, the Oversight Committee. And he first came to our attention, at least my attention, really as kind of an ashen-faced congressman who had just seen some very alarming documents at the White House that we started learning about were documents of so-called unmasking of American citizens. No one knew really in the public knew what unmasking was. We were just coming to this notion that Americans had been spied upon. We would be learning about the Trump campaign being spied upon. I mean, these were actually, I'm sorry, this would be early 2017 when he became part of the story. But this is the story we've been living with that's dominated the Trump presidency, torn it to shreds, and probably might well be considered a exercise in psychological torture of the president himself, with, I think, tremendously adverse effects today. I don't think that a human being can go through what Donald Trump has been put through as a result of these investigations and remain healthy and strong without needing an awful lot of rest and recuperation. So this is kind of what we're looking at today. And what I'd like to introduce here is, you're describing the draconian measures that we're all finding ourselves waking up to, living in a Twilight Zone episode of dystopia here in America. And then lo and behold, in the middle of all this, in the last week, we get this dump of sworn oath testimonies by some 50-odd participants and observers and experts in this same Trump-Russia conspiracy, never before seen in the public domain. Almost like throwing out a bag of gemstones onto the ground, and hungry, starving people start picking them up and turning them over in the light and laughing and being happy about them. And I just found it, when these stories started to emerge, I found myself getting quite enraged over what we were learning. The Congress, including Chairman Nunes and the House Intelligence Committee, had known about, had in their possession for 2 and 3 years. And this kind of made me start thinking back on the last few years. And we kind of put together this show in the sense of looking at what was the real object of these investigations. Was this committee, was Devin Nunes ever really about getting to the bottom of Trump-Russia collusion? And I would like to make the case that that was never going to happen using the strategy that he took. I can't really speak to motivation, not knowing the man, but I think that there are a number of crossroads where he took one route rather than the other, that we can start seeing a trail taking him and the Intelligence Committee and the Republican Party and President Trump's presidency, the American people, away from the central events at the core of this Trump-Russia narrative. And so that is kind of what I'd like to talk about today.
Yeah, and I mean, that's explosive. It's actually something that I've suspected for a long time. And anytime I've said anything other than Devin Nunes is a saint, people get really mad. And This is a component of a social engineering operation. They want to get a large group of people believing in something that is potentially false, so that when someone like you or I say, hey, wait a minute, maybe there's something wrong with that person, this collective sort of swarms to suppress the message, the unwanted message, irrespective of its truth or falsehood. They just want to suppress it.
Right. Well, it doesn't fit, and people don't like to color outside the lines. But let's just start with something that became known to the public right away at the very beginning of this entire ordeal, through the words, the testimonies. I think he appeared 4 times on Capitol Hill, the testimonies of James Comey, the former FBI director, who started testifying back in early or mid 2017, I guess it was. And what he told these committees each time he testified, and what I started writing about, that's why I say I've been covering this for 3 years, this very alarming question that has never been answered. What he told the American people innumerable times was that when the DNC thought they had some kind of problem involving an intrusion or interruption or a breach of their computer security back in the spring of 2016, they did not call the FBI. They called their lawyer at the highly democratic law firm of Perkins Coie, and that man, Michael Sussman, that law partner, called in a Democratic a contractor for the DNC named CrowdStrike. And CrowdStrike came in and did its number on the DNC servers and concluded that Russia had attacked the election, had attacked the DNC. And the FBI accepted this investigation by a DNC contractor, namely CrowdStrike, and never actually took possession of the servers, never actually did its own forensic investigation. And when you actually think about what this means, given how important this allegation was, and it wasn't an allegation, it was presented to us as fact, we were actually looking at a possible cause of war in terms of accusing Russia of attacking our election, attacking the Democratic National Committee. And the FBI was accepting secondhand information to make this incredibly incendiary and potentially catastrophic, bloody, dangerous assessment. And so James Comey, each time he appeared, would be asked about this, and no senator or congressman raised an eyebrow over hearing that the FBI did not deploy its own computer cyber experts. They accepted CrowdStrike's report. And so I started writing about this back in 2017. I think the first piece I did was called "It's Time to Pull the Pin on, quote, Russian, quote, hacking," because this was the basis of the charge. This was sort of the centerpiece of the entire attack on President Trump as being installed in office by Vladimir Putin. Because, of course, the next piece of the story, people remember, is that not only did Russia attack the DNC and steal these very damaging, embarrassing emails about how the DNC and Hillary Clinton were essentially conniving against Bernie Sanders for at that time running strongly for the Democratic nomination, but that Russia then passed them to their agent, alleged agent, Julian Assange, who did Russia's bidding by releasing them through WikiLeaks, all to benefit Donald Trump. So this is the core slander against the presidency from which everything else follows. And when you actually realize that there's no forensic evidence that can be considered credible for it, that the U.S. government was, again, relying on this very suspect company, a company that did not have a good reputation even, although it's quite highly funded by things like the Google complex and things like that, which is another story. It's mind-blowing. But it happened right from the start, and the question was never answered. And just in terms of strike one against Devin Nunes and his Intelligence Committee chairmanship, they never answered it either. They didn't look into it. And just fast forwarding a little bit, when you finally get to their full committee, or the what I guess would be considered the Republican report on Russian active measures in the 2016 election, which was released, I guess, in trying to remember if it would be the spring of 2018 or 19. Must have been 2018. Yes, 2018. They just take Russian hacking, Russian in quotation marks, hacking, as a given. There's no investigation. They did not include any evidence about this curious, let's say, to put it mildly, FBI decision. And they just accept Russian hacking without any evidence. So that's kind of strike one.
Before we move off of strike one,
yeah.
I just want to add to what you're saying. It's not only a matter of the FBI accepting this testimony without question. I think we need to remind viewers that two of the principals at CrowdStrike are very questionable themselves. Right. The chief technology officer, I believe, is he the chief technology, COO, something like that? Sean Henry, a former FBI cyber cop. So it at least requires us to ask. Yeah, he's...
And not only that, a protege of Robert Mueller,
right,
later to become the special counsel, right.
Well, it causes me to believe, Diana, that this CrowdStrike is actually what's known as a cutout for the FBI,
Yes.
a company that's created specifically to carry out things that pesky little laws prevent the FBI from doing. But by making a private company that is essentially controlled by the FBI, they can do things that allow them to kind of dance between the raindrops of the law. This guy's the chief technology officer, Dmitry Alperovich, who I believe he's a Russian expatriate or he's an anti-Putin Russian or something. So they're very questionable.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Born in Moscow, I believe. Yes. Very questionable also with ties to the Atlantic Council,
Yes.
which takes us sort of the globalist political sphere as well. Again, and also ultimately very heavily backed by, I should have looked it up for today's program, but the sort of alphabet Google world. I mean, the company is capitalized to a tremendous extent, and that is a whole nother financial story that should be told as well. But just simply for purposes of the political ramifications here, yes, it's a staggering lapse. I mean, again, you say, really, that you don't actually completely pull the rug out under the allegations by pointing this out and getting to the bottom of that. I mean, that is something that it was almost as if the committee, the intelligence committee, determined where they could operate, what really drew a little circus ring for themselves to sort of operate inside, and kept things like the CrowdStrike piece of the story outside it. Another piece of the story that is outside it is, for example, without forensic evidence of this Russian hack that they took on faith, and the Republicans did as well, they also had to ignore actual forensic evidence that was developed by a team of former intelligence experts, veteran intelligence professionals for sanity, like VIPS, led by a former technical director at NSA, William Binney. They developed a forensic theory with their own evidence that they gleaned from the actual emails that WikiLeaks published. They came up with a very compelling theory that it could not have been this external hack from Russia, that it probably was downloaded to a thumb drive or other device internally, which gives this notion of more of a internal leak rather than a foreign hack. Another piece of that story has to do with the fact that had it been the way it was told to the American people, the NSA almost 100% would have actually been able to track it instantly, given their capabilities of just tracking things along the internet. And that's the simple version of that. But this is something
I just want to add one piece there.
Yeah.
Sorry, because I have seen that evidence as well. The Veteran Intelligence Professionals for Sanity group includes among them Bill Binney, who was with the NSA, who's been on this show many times. And it also includes an individual who we may be talking about a little later, Robert David Steele, self-proclaimed ex-CIA agent who, in an interview with Alex Jones, revealed that he believes that NASA has a colony of children on Mars who are sent there on a 20-year trip, despite the fact that NASA came out with a public statement saying that's totally false. And current technology, it takes between 5 and 7 months to travel to Mars, not 20 years. Bill Binney has also failed to explain how his theory would obviate the possibility that someone might have downloaded this material from the internet via a hack and then copied it to a thumb drive, resulting in the evidence that he evaluated, the times, etc. So I'm not sure I agree with that theory, and I also want people to keep in mind that this concept of infiltration, of double-crossing, of presenting someone as a friend who actually is not, is so important to the notion of social engineering and counterintelligence that it is constantly being attempted. And I'm very skeptical of evidence brought forward by the veteran intelligence professionals for sanity. And it's also important to note that Robert David Steele is being represented in Steele v. Goodman, a defamation case he's brought against me, by a lawyer named Stephen S. Biss, who also represents Devin Nunes in a variety of lawsuits against journalists who in my opinion, appear to have presented unfavorable but truthful information that Devin Nunes seems to want to suppress. So it's interesting to note that connection, and it causes me to wonder if there might be something bigger at play.
Well, those are all fair points, but if I am trying to conduct an investigation into what happened, I would call them in. I would look at their information. I would get it on the record. I would get an expert, not me, to ask the question, to try to really flesh this out. Because again, you have this Nunes committee relying on CrowdStrike or not even anything in the writing of their report that accepts this notion of a Russian hack without evidence. So I think the Binney information, there are a lot of other people involved in trying to do these experiments that they did. I think it's certainly worth
investigating for sure.
Absolutely. So this is more, it isn't so much that I would, say this is the answer or that is the answer, but I am looking, as a journalist, I am looking at the method by which they went about trying to come up with a rigorous set of facts that explains what happened to Donald Trump in 2016 and after. So it's more about the investigation itself rather than whether I can't speak to whether the Binney theory is correct. It makes sense to me. Maybe it doesn't. But again, should have been interviewed, never interviewed. Given his professional credentials, he should have been interviewed. So there's that piece of it. But there's a worse case than not bringing Binney into this investigation. And I would say this is sort of the be-all, end-all, because it's again, not just the Nunes committee, it's every other investigator, including most journalists, including certainly the Mueller investigation. And to date, as we are sort of sifting through the rubble at this point with these new little gemstones we got from this release of sworn testimonies, and that is nobody interviewed Julian Assange, the publisher of these emails that are supposed to be the heart of the Russian-Trump collusion. This is staggering. If you are looking at this, if you gave this to a detective in a town somewhere and just gave him a list of the persons involved in a crime, it would be like taking the top witness and just simply putting him in a jail cell in a supermax, which is actually where Julian Assange is right now, dying. Yeah. So you've got that aspect. So in other words, my question again is, were they after the truth about what happened in the creation of the Trump-Russian narrative? And I do submit, I do not think they were, just by these first few strikes. I mean, this is serious business to conduct taxpayer-funded national investigations at this level of the presidency, the sanctity of our election, the misuse of our intelligence capabilities to direct them against political opposition. I mean, nothing could be more serious. And to see the investigators pulling their punches from the get-go, even the investigators who are putatively pro-Trump, pro-presidency, pro-constitution, pro-secure elections. I mean, this is a huge, can we call it a gaffe? I don't think it can be a gaffe. It had to have been a decision not to bring these aspects up. And there's another piece of it as well. If we consider that the WikiLeaks themselves, or the emails that WikiLeaks published, and of course there's also the Podesta emails that came out later, but if we're just looking at that summer event where all of this crystallized as the emails were published just as the Democratic National Convention was meeting in July of 2016, you had a death on the streets of a violent death, a murder on the streets of Washington, D.C. I believe it was on July 10th, right before this DNC convention or Democratic convention started, just as the WikiLeaks would begin to roll out that same week, of a not just a staffer, I believe his title was Director of Data Expansion. I believe yes, you've got him on the screen. Seth Rich, rest in peace. Seth Rich, a young man working inside the DNC, certainly a director of data expansion, who would be later discussed a month later. So you've got the July 10 murder, the DNC and the WikiLeaks rollout of the week, I think it was about December 20th, the Russia narrative starting to really heat up. And then on August 10th, Julian Assange, publisher of WikiLeaks, was interviewed on a Dutch TV show. You can still find it online, where he discusses Seth Rich in the context of his murder and how WikiLeaks is offering a reward to discover the killer of Seth Rich. And when he was quizzed about this, because of course the interviewer said, "Are you saying he was your source?" He all but says he was the source, and says that sources for WikiLeaks are very upset when these types of things happen. So WikiLeaks has a blanket policy of not identifying sources. That was about as close to at least a tentative idea as I can possibly imagine. And you have all these things happening. And again, what happens to the story? Does the House in committee look at this? No. If you go through these, I think there are almost 60 sworn testimonies now available that the committee looked at starting in the summer of 2017. There's no discussion of Assange. There's no discussion of Seth Rich for sure. There's very little about CrowdStrike, except we do get confirmation from Sean Henry. I didn't even know Sean Henry had ever gone before the committee because he turned them down, and I didn't know he went back. Sean Henry admitted they did not have proof that the Russians exfiltrated, or anyone else literally exfiltrated, what they were actually assessing to make their determination. So you had this very constrained investigation from the start. They didn't really want to find out what happened at the DNC, and that's not just the Democrats, that is the Nunes committee. They didn't want to ask Julian Assange, the publisher of these emails at the heart of the scandal. They didn't want to, at least later, I mean, I don't know if Seth Rich was the source. There's a lot of evidence that he was. However, his murder has never been investigated in any forthright manner. And now we have these testimonies being released, people thrilled to bits, people on the side of the president thrilled to bits. We have just recently, we have the new names of the people involved in the very high level of Vice President Biden involved in unmasking General Flynn. One of the most unsurprising documents I think I've ever seen, actually, because I looked at the names, I thought, yeah, I mean, it was really, okay, it's nice to have confirmation, I agree. However, there's no surprise there.
Right.
But think about that. Why weren't those people already under some kind of legal jeopardy brought by the Justice Department, given their misuse of the unmasking proviso in this? I mean, it's incredible. We get it out on Twitter and we dance, but nothing happens. So this is
let me pause you for a second, Diana,
yes, sure.
because I want to introduce some information that perhaps you might be unfamiliar with, or certainly members of our audience might be unfamiliar with. Talking a lot about very valid points, Julian Assange, Seth Rich, the alleged murder. I want to point out that, these lawsuits seem to play a key role in this social engineering campaign, the lawfare aspect. When we look at what's happened with President Trump and the impeachment, that was a legal process, a constitutional process where he's essentially being put on trial. That's presidential lawfare. We had an interview yesterday with the wife of convicted former Congressman Steve Stockman, who was subjected to a legal process, which he denies the allegations, and his wife has admitted that they just didn't have the financial wherewithal to continue the fight. While we're talking about Devin Nunes and his lawyer, Stephen Biss, and we introduced this notion of why was Seth Rich not properly investigated, the murder, why was he not introduced in the House Intelligence Committee, it's interesting to note that his brother, Aaron Rich, is suing in civil court Edward Butowski, the individual who hired the private investigator for the family. Edward Butowski has been separately represented by Devin Nunes' lawyer, Stephen Biss. So there's a lawsuit against NPR in which Ed Butowski, represented by lawyer Stephen Biss, sued NPR and David Falkenflik for accurately reporting on a failed lawsuit. This is all related to the Seth Rich case. So I don't know what to make of this, but I like to present it to smart people like you and people in our audience, because it's clear to me that information like this is not out there in the mainstream. You know, most people don't even know about this. And all the same people that are floating around the WikiLeaks story, the Seth Rich murder story, they seem to be suing each other. They seem to be represented or somehow know this guy, Stephen Biss. Why is Devin Nunes represented by a lawyer with so many ethical conflicts in his past? Stephen Biss lost his law license in 2009 or 2010 for his participation in a $21 million escrow fraud. He was excoriated by a federal judge, William Pauley, here in the Southern District of New York. Stephen Biss has been the subject of a lot of legal news lately because he's just been getting totally yelled at by judges everywhere he goes, essentially. He is representing Devin Nunes's dad and brother. The judge told them to put up or shut up in a defamation lawsuit over that Esquire article we were looking at previously. And this is a pattern where Stephen Biss seems to attract clients who want to sue journalists for statements that they make, which may in fact be true, but are unfavorable to their clients. And something that I've observed, Diana, is that by putting these types of things into lawsuits, they can take a totally baseless accusation, a totally false premise, and sort of strap some credibility onto it by putting it into a federal lawsuit. Now you can have truthful articles that say a federal lawsuit alleges such and such outrageous claim about a person, in the same way we see Adam Schiff and his committees doing this kind of nonsense to the president. It's remarkably similar, the approach these guys all take.
It really is. It really is. That's fascinating. It's really hard to parse. And then on the other side of it, you know, in terms of bread and circuses for the rest of us, I guess, you know, we get these dumps of information that don't advance the story. In other words, we don't learn more.
That's a limited hangout.
Exactly. It's a limited hangout. And for example, just another lawyer that represents Ed Butowski in a different case.
Can I guess before you say it? I was going to say Ty Clevenger. Exactly. He's another guy.
I think, but he is pressing Richard Grenell, the acting director of national intelligence, to release what seems to be NSA intercepts of communications between Seth Rich and WikiLeaks. There seems to be credible evidence that they exist, and the reason I bring that up, because a release of that nature would be a genuine release of information, no matter what it says, even if it just says, "Hi, how are you?" I doubt it says that, but you know what I'm saying. Just releasing the record, not cutting and pasting it into fitting these narratives that have been pre-approved, pre-digested, and essentially stamped into us. That is really where, you know, your eye should go in terms of looking at these releases, the current releases that essentially confirm what we already knew about the Spygate case, about the Trump-Russia case. It just is confirmation, more official confirmation, sworn oath of confirmation, but nothing really new that we hadn't already pieced together. But again, getting to the Nunes piece of it, considering that he and the other Republicans had this information for 2 and 3 years and allowed it to remain under the classification order of the Director of National Intelligence. In other words, from what I can tell, or I think it's a fact actually, in September of 2018, the House Intelligence Committee voted unanimously to send these classified or these closed session interviews with some 53 or 58 people to the Director of National Intelligence to have them declassified, to have him look at them for national security issues and declassify them and release them. That's September 2018. The next communication I can find is the representative or the assistant to the DNI writing to the committee in November after the election of 2018 saying, "Thank you, we've received them." So it seems like there was this nice little 2-month block of no action that could have, I would say, changed the election. Certainly was a chance. that it would have completely undermined the Mueller case at that point and just brought all of this corruption out at a time where voting mattered. So people say, oh, the Mueller investigation just collapsed. He was a blithering fool in front of Congress. Ha, ha, ha. No, it was mission accomplished. They flipped the House. That's what that special counsel investigation did. Flipped the House. In looking at the lack of a release there, well, people will say in defense, I've had people say this to me, well, Devin Nunes can't overrule or can't affect the DNI ruling on these things. And I'm thinking to myself, since when did Congress become an adjunct of the executive branch? I mean, I know it is de facto, but
Right.
in terms of the way it's supposed to work, this was not just some sort of nicety. This was of the highest order importance to the American people to know this information, and whether the DNI declassified it or not, that information should have been brought to the American people. And I would say that is a very strong strike against those Republicans who were, especially because the Democrats weren't interested. That's why I don't mention them. They wouldn't want the American people to know it. But that, to me, why did you swear an oath to uphold and defend the Constitution? Why do you think that your responsibility is to follow this declassification order of the executive branch? I mean, this is not why we elect and send representatives to Washington to watch over our interests. This very well is we're looking at the fall of the Trump presidency that is aided and abetted by this information not coming out in a timely fashion. Yeah. It's too late now.
Well, let me ask
so
you this,
this, I would
Diana.
say, is another strike. Yeah.
Yeah. Just to make sure I understand what you're saying. Because a lot of people said the same thing to me. I was really disappointed that Devin Nunes essentially just sat there while Adam Schiff conjured up this fake impeachment out of pure lies and nonsense. And people would say, well, he can't do anything. He's just the ranking member. What would have stopped Devin Nunes from calling up President Trump, having a personal meeting with him and saying, hey, I'm aware of this evidence. Schiff is moving forward with a gigantic nothing burger. Couldn't he have done that? I mean, he has the president's ear.
Yes. Yes. I mean, people will say, and I've had this said to me as well, the White House counsel was in charge of the impeachment, was in charge of but I mean, it's kind of another one of these rationales that just ignore what might also have been. I mean, this was that important. And I would say even before we get to impeachment, that should have happened. That information belonged to the American people before we went to vote in November, and it didn't come out. So this, again, is why when I saw these releases that people literally were clinking champagne glasses over, I was just getting angrier and angrier, because it is having that sort of official confirmation of this corrupt conspiracy against the president, and sitting on it is absolutely unimaginable.
Yeah.
I mean, it's well, it would bring about a constitutional crisis, this or that, and you think, well, why do you have to, instead of selling insurance or living, world traveler, or why did you go? This is why you went.
We're losing you a bit here, Diana. There's a hit on your internet signal for a second. So you're saying, what about world traveling?
Well, I would just say, when you make a choice to go into public life and represent not just your district, but become a chairman of such an important committee, and see evidence of political activity, indeed the presidential campaign, indeed the presidency, it is your duty to ring the alarm. The Congress is a great way to do it.
We're having some disruption of your Skype signal, which I hope is just a coincidence. But I think what you're saying is that irrespective of Devin Nunes' position as the chairman or the ranking member, when he becomes aware of this level, did we lose you, Diana? Oh, you're back.
No, I'm here.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm here. Can you hear me?
Okay. Yes. But what I understand that you're saying is that Devin Nunes, as a member of Congress, as an American citizen, I mean, if I had Donald Trump's phone number, I would call him and tell him this stuff. Why did Devin Nunes not do that?
Well, I don't think that they wanted to open up the scandal to its core. I don't think anyone wanted to go there. They wanted to, and this is what we see now. They want to now say we clung to the notion of Russian collusion straight through the Mueller investigation. And when I say we, I mean the narrative, even by the Republicans, that there was Russian analysis of Russian collusion, even if they also at the same time were saying that Donald Trump was not colluding with the Russians. And every time you admit this notion of Russian hacking for Donald Trump, you were feeding into really enshrining this narrative. So why would they do that? I don't think they wanted to open up the whole thing. They didn't want to find out about CrowdStrike. They didn't want to find out about Julian Assange. They didn't want to see if Sedgwick was involved or other. And there were a number of other people to call. There was the United Kingdom former ambassador
Craig Murray.
Right out and was Craig Murray. Sorry about that. Was interviewed about his knowledge of who the person was and how it all went down. And he himself was actually an intermediary on one of these sort of handoffs of information in Washington, D.C. when he visited
Actually, he
for a
denied
conference.
that. That was a false story that was injected by a social engineer.
Really, into Daily Mail?
Well, let's take a look. We've got this interview.
Okay.
Let's see if we can get this to play here.
Oh, you're so sharp, Jason. I didn't know that.
Nice to meet you. We're from the U.S. and we were wondering, we've been following the Seth Rich story for quite some time now.
I've seen you on YouTube.
Have you really? Crowdsource the Truth, you're watching. It's really an honor to meet you, sir.
George Webb, is that
Yes. George is in the United States right now working on the part of the story that led us down a potential dirty bomb that may have been aboard one of the cargo ships that came into port in Charleston the other night. So it seems to have set off some sort of firestorm. And in the meantime, we came here to see, we wanted to find Eric Braverman, who was the CEO of the Clinton Foundation and had gone missing.
It was vanished.
Yes, and so George Webb's series, of course. And when we heard Julian was supposed to come out, we were thrilled, so we ran over here. And we were wondering if you would be able to talk to us about the thumb drive or any of the details that you've shared before, and maybe could just review what you have now, and if Seth may have been the person that handed it to you.
I don't really want to say much more. I've been carefully avoiding saying much more for many months. I would say there wasn't a thumb drive.
Okay.
Well, it may have been a thumb drive, but I didn't have it. What I was doing was administrative, let me put it that way, as opposed to picking up emails on a dead letter drop. I was doing something. Even whistleblowers have administration and bureaucracy. So I was doing something administrative. And
So that's pretty much the total of what he says there, is that he did not have a thumb drive and he was mostly carrying out an administrative role. People can find that interview on Crowdsource the Truth's YouTube library. But it's interesting, isn't it?
Well, he didn't deny contact.
Say again?
He didn't deny contact in, I think it was September of 2016.
With Seth Rich?
This would not have been Seth Rich. No. He was not. No, it was another putative WikiLeaks source.
Got it. But there's a lot of confusing information. There's a lot of misinformation, a lot of disinformation. I think the most important point that none of this stuff affects is that there really wasn't an investigation in the FBI, in the Intelligence Committee, in anywhere in Congress or elsewhere that was going through the proper channels of trying to find answers to these questions. They manipulated evidence, they manipulated witnesses, they selected the investigators that they wanted to present what appeared to be evidence that was really just crafted in such a way that it strengthened the story they wanted people to believe.
That's true. I think that's very true. And we try to piece things together, but we don't have the resources of the House Intelligence Committee or the FBI, certainly, and all the rest of it. So yes, there was no effort to actually get it straight. And you think about the time and budget and resources of these institutions, it's pretty shocking. The special counsel didn't do it either. In fact, there's even a little footnote in the Mueller report where they just admit that they did not do due diligence on the DNC server. They just accepted the word. It's true. It's amazing. It's really an amazing lack. But here's another strike against our Republican friends, which is when they finally had Robert Mueller in front of them in July of 2019. They didn't ask him about this either. And I actually wrote a column about this. I was, again, completely out of step with other conservatives who were watching this dog and pony show. They were thrilled. They thought it was the most fun they'd ever had watching a hearing, as Robert Mueller seemed quite foggy and didn't really seem to know. Maybe he hadn't even read the report. I mean, he was doing a marvelous performance, I suppose, or he, truly is diminished. But no, I was, again, terrifically exercised over the lack of questions about these basic elements of the original crime. CrowdStrike, how could the FBI just let that go? They had Robert Mueller there. How could he let that go? How can you claim a systemic, continuous interference by Russia in the election? I think the words were something like that from his report, when you are relying on no evidence to make that charge. I mean, ultimately, there's no evidence for that incredibly foundational piece of it. So they didn't want to unmask that either, or they didn't understand the case. Again, it's hard to know the motivation, but you can observe the behavior, and it's the same direction away from the core frame-up and away from the core frame-up actors. And at this point, where we're kind of correcting the narrative a little bit with these testimonies, particularly the notion that CrowdStrike was completely shoddy in its a declaration that Russia hacked the DNC. Sean Henry admits in these latest releases that no, they really didn't have that evidence. So, yeah, sure. And everyone says, "Oh, we're vindicated." No, we're not vindicated. Now, the entire theory, or it wasn't a theory, that the entire narrative that Russia helped Trump into the White House is not only, it's kind of left hanging there, and there's no replacement because all the other pieces of it have been completely suppressed for years, and nobody remembers that Julian Assange, even to ask about him. And when you think about that horror, this if ever there was a human rights crime against an individual, it is Julian Assange sitting in a supermax prison, dying, literally. You have to remember, and this was something I just picked up today, it was a tally from the WikiLeaks emails, whereby this was at Gateway Pundit back in 2016, at least 65 mainstream media reporters were meeting with and or coordinating offline with top Hillary advisors. This we get from WikiLeaks. So if you want to know why there's a blackout on Julian Assange, that certainly plays into it. He blew their cover on their own collusion with Hillary Clinton, and there's no love lost there among any of these people. So it's a crime that no one wants to look at, and it's an important part of this entire ordeal the American people have been put through, that our own leaders ignore and pretend isn't happening, and indeed are trying to prosecute the man. I mean, the reason he's in jail is he's waiting for his hearing on being extradited to the United States on espionage for journalism. So the whole thing couldn't be more horrific any way you count it.
Yeah, and it just seems like they're trying to slowly kill Julian Assange. It's something that we've seen. It's lawfare against him as well. He's sitting there in jail. He's unable to properly defend himself. He's being just slowly drained down of his health. It's really a travesty. While we speak, Diana, some of the people who are watching and responding in the chat comments, they're saying things like, Devin Nunes has been saying all along that the American people will be stunned when they see these transcripts. How do you and I respond to that?
Well, it's not a matter of proving Devin Nunes right on that on that prediction. It's a matter of acting on it. He's not just a journalist. He's not just, he is someone who had tremendous power that I don't think, I mean, contrast his chairmanship with Adam Schiff's. Adam Schiff was Bigfoot, and Devin Nunes with the Republican majority as chairman was not. And there are other factors feeding into that, including leadership that didn't support him. Okay, fine, whatever. He's still chairman, and he still had a lot of resources that I don't think he used. And just being right. I mean, I've had people say to me also, he's right, and he's a national treasure for being right. And no, he was chairman of the Intelligence Committee while we were investigating the worst crime against a presidency in our memory, maybe ever, in terms of certainly on a par with anything that's ever happened, if not the worst, in terms of the utter subversion of our intelligence agencies and our police state powers of these agencies and the FBI against normal political electioneering. I mean, the outrages and the invasions and the breaking of our Bill of Rights and all the rest of it are stunning. And so he, as an authoritative elected official there to uphold and defend the Constitution against enemies, foreign and domestic, he fell down on this job. And whether it was a strategy fail or whether there was something darker, we can talk about that. We can disagree about that, or we can, still investigate that. But I think the pattern of behavior and decision making all takes us to this circus ring where we get certain pieces of the scandal put forward, and the most important pieces still remain outside and still, shrouded evermore in darkness. And we'll never know if Seth Rich is connected. We'll never know what Julian Assange has to say about it. He's very likely to die under this torturous conditions he lives in this. He's not even been allowed out for the coronavirus fears, whereby innumerable inmates with tremendously violent records are being let out by the hundreds, if not thousands, around the world. So this is a painful wrong, and it's part of it. Why wasn't he a witness? Why isn't he a witness? They don't want to know what he has to say. Why?
Yeah, it's an excellent question. And, this has been an ongoing mystery as to why they would release criminals for fear that they would get coronavirus, but then arrest citizens for not wearing the mask and engaging in social distancing. This absolutely feeds into the Marxist edict of, I think it was Ho Chi Minh, who said, open the prison doors and the real dragon will fly out. This all feeds into the Black Panthers agenda, the Weather Underground agenda, this concept of a Marxist infiltration of the U.S. government. And when we see someone like Devin Nunes in the powerful position of first chairman and then ranking member of the House Intelligence Committee, I agree with you, Diana. Simply going on Sean Hannity and saying, Americans are going to be shocked when they hear the testimony. I mean, you or I could have said that based on the information that we just surmised from all the things you've been talking about. Devin Nunes, who has seen the transcripts, I fully agree with you, had a duty. It was incumbent upon him to go to the president, to go to the AG and say, look, this has got to stop. There's a crime taking place in the Intelligence Committee. And it brings me to my next question for you, Diana. We're talking about limited hangouts. We're talking about failures to do things. Is this an intelligence operation happening within the House Intelligence Committee? Seems like it.
I don't know the answer. Certainly, it always is, and it seems always to go there. I don't know the answer to that, but I think it's a very valid question. Limited hangouts regarding intelligence and intelligence revelations have a long history. We can just look back to the 1990s when we had these revelations of KGB penetration of U.S. institutions that I believe was very carefully calibrated so as not to expand on our knowledge very much about what had been going on, knowledge developed by the old FBI, developed by the real investigative committees going back to the 1930s, 40s, 50s, and so on, looking at this kind of penetration. And then when we get these revelations, they amazingly match. Are we seeing a new pattern of that? I mean, we are seeing information that only matches what I believe we will continue to be given in this period of revelation, which also is a period of distraction, because even as people are now looking and, you know, you see people talking about, oh, now John Brennan, he's going to be measured for his striped suit for prison. And it's ridiculous to imagine that anything is going to happen because nothing is new. So it's more or less a feeding of the bear, make the bear happy, make the bear dance. And then meanwhile, we have the whole corona tech, some people call it tech fascist, I would call it tech communist system starting to completely envelop us. So it's very painful to watch this information come out, amount to very little, and see it played up almost to make us all feel better as we lose what remains of our literal freedoms to walk outside our homes. So it's, yes, I mean, it could well be that very thing. And it definitely feels like manipulation, very heavy manipulation.
Yeah. And, you know, while we're talking, you're raising some important points. We're talking about limited hangouts, intelligence operations, et cetera. Isn't it very well known that it was a KGB tactic to plant stories in foreign press and then have that be revealed to the American press? Like, ooh, look at this little story over here coming out of the Dutch press. I mean, this is the perfect setup. American people, to this day, I have no idea what the guy's name is who is interviewing Julian Assange. It's certainly not Anderson Cooper. It's not Sean Hannity. And that's not to say he's not a good journalist, but this is a tactic that they use to plant stories in these lesser known media outlets, and then something like the Washington Post, the New York Times can say, Dutch television has reported XYZ. This sort of absolves them of any liability. I mean, it's literally the same exact tactic that's used against me. They get some blatant liar to put out a blatant lie. Then they create a fake news website to say this person says X about Jason Goodman. Then Devin Nunes' lawyer can put it into a federal lawsuit where he has immunity from defamation. They can say whatever they want about you in a lawsuit, and you cannot sue for defamation. But those false claims become public information that then other news sources, legitimate or not, can report on.
Oh, sure. That's a very common disinformation tactic. Although I would say in this particular case, I don't know that the Washington Post or the New York Times ever really reported it, because talking about Seth Rich was something, and it still is something. I mean, you referred to the lawsuits earlier. It is dangerous to talk about him and not to in terms that don't frame him as part of this vicious conspiracy theory to tar him and his family. I mean, I don't think there was a lot of coverage of what Julian Assange said about him. It was probably pretty much passing coverage, because these media organs did not want that story either, in line with the whole narrative creation that was underway and still is underway. And indeed, his plight is barely covered in these same organs. So there's a little difference in that particular story. But I mean, Seth Rich, there was one congressman who brought up his name in public that I know of, and his name was Blake Farenthold. This would have been, I guess, in the summer of 2017. And he brought him up in an interview. I think it might have been on CNN or MSNBC. And I mean, he was excoriated. He was treated like a crazy person. It was, you can look it up. I mean, you'll see a queue of stories about how crazy he was. And then sure enough, I think it was the following year, he was forced to resign from Congress for having used funds, public funds, in some sort of a payout or some kind of a sexual harassment claim. And, you know, that's all well and good. But I mean, we don't know how many congressmen have done that and have not been forced to resign or revealed to engage in such a practice. So I would say the guy was probably targeted because he dared to actually say this. I would say that when his name came up to congressmen, that they, in their own conferences on Capitol Hill, I would say they all looked at their shoes rather than actually have a conversation about what might have happened to Seth Rich. And again, we don't know. We don't know with certainty. We just know there's a lot of evidence there. And when you actually see that he worked at the place that was the source of these emails, you would think that a legitimate investigation would at least cross it off by having an investigation. We know, due to some FOIAs, due to some information reveals, that the FBI was actually discussing him. There was recently a Judicial Watch communique in their FOIA on Strzok and Page, the FBI lovebirds, that actually has an email, much redacted, where they say blank quashed it with blank, the Seth Rich, the email subject line being Seth Rich. You can look that up. I mean, he was under discussion, not in terms of what happened to that. We're FBI agents. We should find out, could that possibly have anything to do with this whole larger crisis we're in? No, it was in terms of how to deal with the media who might question someone at the FBI because Julian Assange had brought it up in that Dutch interview. So there's so much wrong at every level that also extends to the House, the Republican House, because they at least had the power to run some of this stuff down or try or tell the American people that they couldn't and be frank, rather than just comply and just make sure nobody talked about Assange, nobody talked about Seth Rich, nobody talked about CrowdStrike. Everyone just accepted the FBI scandal of perpetrating this fraud on us based on no forensic evidence that they had developed.
Yeah. And, you know, one of our viewers accurately comments that anytime CNN mentions the debunked conspiracy theory, that's almost like code for there is actually no evidence that's been used to debunk anything. And they label someone a conspiracy theorist because there's a lot of people who will just see that, say, oh, well, this is CNN. This person must be a conspiracy theorist. I'll tell you, Diana, for my own personal, this is just my opinion, I do not believe anything at all about the Seth Rich story. I think it is a piece of meat on the bone that is thrown to people. There's a community that exists now that did not exist when, let's say, the JFK assassination took place or any of these other things that are questionable or shrouded in mystery or remain unsolved, that are considered by the CNNs of the world to be conspiracy theories. When the JFK assassination occurred, a lawyer by the name of Mark Lane was not satisfied with the conclusions of the Warren Commission or even I think it was before the Warren Commission. He wasn't satisfied that the investigation was being done properly, and he started his own investigation, as lawyers will often do when they're dealing with a legal case. And what he found was there was a lot of contradictory evidence that, as you point out, was being ignored. So I think that this branding of something as a conspiracy theory is something that they do to get it out of the mainstream. But there's a new tactic because they recognize that there's a growing group of people who are getting their news not from CNN, but from journalists and authors like yourself and from resources like Crowdsource the Truth. So there is an active effort to make us all look foolish, to plant false stories that are specifically intended to attract our attention and to mix them in with the most damaging stories that would bring down these sinister elements that have infiltrated our government. So with things like QAnon, for instance, they can get a lot of people to rally around that, and then they fill that with false information so that they can point to the foolish predictions or guesses or false stories that these types of things cause people to rally around. And it's just like this Pied Piper strategy that was named in WikiLeaks: get everybody to rally around Donald Trump, then present something that destroys his reputation, and all those people rallied around him lose credibility, and the whole thing goes down in a ball of flames. Diana, we're just about out of time for our show this week, but I want to remind people to visit dianawest.net, and they can learn all about you and stay on top of your postings. People can follow you on Twitter, of course. And I have your Amazon library ready here somewhere. Is there anything you want to say to our viewers before we end for today?
No, I think we've covered quite a lot of ground. I hope that it causes some reflection and testing of these narratives. And it's just so easy to fool us all. And you bring up some good points in terms of who knows what's false and what's real. That's what's so difficult, and that's why we need to do it ourselves and really look closely at these narratives and just chew them up.
Absolutely. And again, I mean, you know, I personally find when there's this confluence of obvious evidence, it feels to me like the question that we need to ask ourselves is, who would want us to believe a particular thing or another, and to really explore every avenue. For people who want to follow Diana on Twitter, which I highly recommend, you can do it by just searching for @Diana_West_. And Diana's constantly tweeting out important stories and her own insights into all the things that our viewers are going to be interested in hearing about and learning more about. I want to thank you, Diana, for joining me again today. It's always a very interesting conversation, and we'll see you soon.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Jason. I enjoyed it.
And thanks everybody for watching. Have a great day.